The SciComm Collective acknowledges the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands we study, write and record on, and that their sovereignty was never ceded. Hello and welcome to the SciComm Collective.
Different useful knowledge in different areas.
The joy is sharing it.
Making science accessible.
The ignored final step of the scientific method.
Every different perspective.
Science is culture.
The SciComm Collective brings science and science communication to you.
Welcome back to another episode of SciComm Collective. I'm Kate.
I'm Kelly. And I'm Holly.
And today we're going to be discussing the deficit model of communicating science. What is it? Why is it problematic? First things first, what is the deficit model, Kelly?
So basically, the deficit model, we've been taught in the Masters of Science Communication that it's this way of thinking about communicating science that assumes that your non-scientific audiences, in some senses, are empty vessels suffering from a deficit of scientific knowledge, waiting to be filled with the wisdom of science. So it kind of assumes that scientists are held on a pedestal and the general public don't really know about science, and it's like a very one-way form of communication. So it's problematic in some senses. What do you guys reckon?
The crazy thing is I've been in the Masters of Science Communication course only as of this semester, and I worked in science communication adjacent fields. I also have the background of being a health professional, and this is the first time that I have ever encountered the deficit model, which I think is absolutely wild. So what do I think about it? It's a brand new novel concept to me that has completely changed the way I see the world, because being a healthcare professional, a lot of it is communicating healthcare advice to someone else. And I just assumed, like, granted, my healthcare professional career was very short, but you just assume that they don't know anything. So you need to give them all the information possible to make them, make your patients have the best possible outcomes, to make decisions about their health. And the fact that I've learnt about sheep farming in Cambria and people know stuff and that we can both create scientific knowledge is just completely wild to me. So that's my take. It's brand new. It's changing the way I see things. And as a result, for the better, I think, in some regards. So yeah, that one-way communication is definitely how I used to do things.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Holly?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with both the things that you guys have said. I guess I have a bit of a different perspective. I've been hearing about the deficit model for a while now, so it feels very like underpinning the way I perceive almost all kinds of communication and education and stuff now. I guess the main thing I'd want to add on is one of the other assumptions that like that model of communication makes is that by filling that deficit, so by providing just facts alone, people will learn, and also change their behavior, and basically change the behavior to the thing that you wanted, and doesn't really, almost assumes that your audience has no agency, and they sort of have to have no agency for the model to function, which is not what reality is.
No.
It's kind of this idea that like you are going to put all of your information out there and you're just going to expect people to absorb it.
We're going to fact bond them, which is a bit of terminology that gets thrown around. We're going to fact bond them. We're going to give them all the information, and then that way they will make the best decision possible and change everything. And I think an example of this is you go to any social media comment thread, and it's just full of people saying, no, you're wrong, you've got your information wrong, and just trying to almost out information each other and almost expecting as though they're going to change their opinion just by the presentation of brand new facts.
Yeah, just by talking at each other rather than with each other, instead of like meeting someone where they're at and having that inclusive conversation and being like, oh, why do you believe that? And then through that way, you like have more of a leverage to change someone's mind or to actually make a difference.
So we've learned through classes how back in the 1980s and 1990s, Australia had this policy of being a clever country and an intelligent country.
An innovative country.
An innovative country. So as a result, the policy reaction to that is getting public understanding of science and public engagement of science. And this is where my personal experiences come in, because I worked for our science centre here in Perth, SciTech, for a number of years. And that deficit model approach of we're going to give all the information, science is amazing, it's going to change your life. That was what I took on board, and that's how I thought you did science communication. And it's been a rude yet very necessary awakening to realise there is more than one way to do science communication, and that you can work with the people that you're communicating with rather than talking at them. You can talk with them.
You can engage them.
You can engage.
And you can involve them in the scientific process. I think it's so interesting that you raised that, like, having, worked in the industry for a considerable amount of time and it doesn't get across. And I think it's really interesting why it's so hard to get it out of the world of theory and into practice. Like, we've somewhat known about this since approximately the 90s, I would say, in the research, but it's been really, really hard to get, I guess, the evaluation of current science communication methods out there, and to, be asking some questions about why are we actually doing what we're doing? Because I don't think it was ever super intended, like this idea of like, oh, you're lacking in facts, so I'm going to give you facts and you'll change your mind. I don't think that was ever an explicit decision that anyone in particular made. It was just a sort of default mode of operation. You kind of see that with how the Institute of Science is set up as well.
It's kind of just ingrained in society that it's like you hold science on a pedestal and you kind of look at them as this authority figure that you should believe and you should accept their facts and you should just learn it because it's there.
At the same time, though, science holds science on a pedestal.
Yes.
Which is its own can of worms right there.
We're getting meta now.
I'm getting very, very meta. Like, when science puts itself on a pedestal and says this is really important, it's because it does it, it kind of fails to see other approaches
and other ways of knowing,
different epistemologies. I hope I'm saying that correctly, which is the way of making knowledge in the world. That's another term that we've come across recently, for me anyway, in my course. And that science is not the only epistemic way of knowing. There's Aboriginal Australian knowledges, which are just as equally valid as science. And
there's also just like lived experience is like a prime example of knowledge building as well. And everyone knows what they know because of their background and because of their lived experience. And like, I wrote this blog that was basically on bird watching, and it kind of like highlighted the lay expertise model of science, where it's like people who don't have any scientific qualification, they still might have an interesting point to bring to the conversation about science. And they're like, there might be people who have been bird watching for many of years, who have seen the same birds come and go from their front porch, and they know the migratory patterns and they know the seasons and stuff of these birds, but they, for some reason, aren't held on the same standard as an ornithologist or as a scientist, but they still know these birds and they are still scientists in the way that they look at things because they're observing, you know?
yeah.
And I think their knowledge is also extremely valuable to science, even though they're not scientists.
Well, that could be segued into the different modes of communication in some ways, because they do know, like, people out in the world who are not scientists do know stuff. So there's someone called Alan Irwin, who is a science and technology sociologist, I think that STS.
Yeah, I think so.
Researcher. Yeah, STS researcher. Yeah, so Alan Irwin is an STS researcher, and through their work, they've presented different modes of communication. So the deficit model is one-way approach, and then we have dialogue and participatory as the two other methods. Irwin champions the participatory method, which is third order, And
it's
then
more like citizen science and like transdisciplinary science where you're involving people in the scientific process, right?
correct.
Yeah, trying to get a real power shift there, I'd say, is the key thing, trying to really eliminate that sort of scientist determining what is being studied.
Like that scientist in the lead position being like, you follow me, you do these, you'll learn kind of thing. Whereas like they're involved in the whole process.
Yeah. And then in the middle, you've got dialogue, which is two-way. So you're both having a conversation.
We'll move on. We don't need light.
Don't need light.
We don't need light for a podcast.
For those of you
Spooky.
listening at home, the lights just dimmed. So
The light's just turned off. So
this
it's
room might be haunted. We don't know.
spooky. As I was saying, and then there's dialogue, which is two-way communication. So you're both talking, I'm trying not to say general public because that is a very
Audience?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the varied audience and the scientists talk together. So
That's
two-way.
another little caveat in science communication is the distinction of the general public and how that others them from being included in science. And by having this distinction of being like, oh, there's science over here, and then there's the general public, it kind of creates this divide where then the public, in inverted commas, don't think that they can have a voice in science or in scientific research or anything, and they kind of feel removed from it. So even just by saying the general public, it's kind of othering because scientists are part of the general public and we're all like have backgrounds in science and science communication, and scientists are like among us, you know, it's all of us. Yeah.
Well, on that point, the general public, others, but not, you have to recognize too that as part of general public and as part of audiences, scientists are included in that. You can't have one without the other. They are inherently part of the general public or part of your audience, part of the audience, varied audiences that are out there in the world. So you've got a really interesting quote here, Kelly, and I'm just going to read it out. The public is diagnosed as ignorant of and lacking interest in science. The main symptoms of the condition are aversion, anxiety, and mistrust. The prescribed cure, science pills, directions, swallow facts.
Shout out to Heather for that in one of our lectures. Yeah, I think what I was trying to get at there is like scientists kind of look at the public as ignorant and they don't really know about science and they're lacking this knowledge. And so they think the cure to that is to share that knowledge and just be like, here's all the information, and then assuming they will learn from it. But this can actually create further aversion to it because those people that are digesting or like trying to understand that knowledge have no idea what they're talking about or are just confused, or, you know, they're not being communicated it in an engaging and meaningful way.
Oh, God, I love that quote as well. I think it also gives us a bit of an understanding as to why this type of communication has been so persistent, because it's such a convenient thing if it were true.
Yeah.
It would be so easy to solve so many problems if you could just, if it was true, right? If it was, the only problem was that there was a deficit of knowledge, because you can fill that. That's a problem you can solve. So it's really convenient to believe that problem exists. But unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I mean, the classic example is we all lived through a pandemic. I know most people want to forget about that, but flashbacks. I know Heather Bray in our lectures has mentioned how that's when science communication was really tested. And you could argue it was really tempting to just give a whole bunch of information about COVID-19. Also recognizing at the same time, we didn't have a lot of information about COVID-19. But at the same time, the public had to be taken along. The public. So
It's so ingrained in how we talk.
Yeah.
But communicating how vaccines were being created, people had to be taken along that journey about why we can't just pull one out of the hat But at the same time, there was a lot of almost pushback or distrust about, well, these vaccines have been created too quickly. And it's like, no, we've actually been working on these vaccines for different types of like coronavirus. So this is why we can pull it out and work on it, and we can share our information. So people were taken on the journey of scientific discovery. And yeah, COVID-19 showed us a lot of things, but that's where communicating to the public again, but scare quotes, it was really important.
Non-scientific audiences.
Non-scientific audiences.
Oh, that's still probably a little problematic, but
I feel like the main thing to take away from the whole, like, no, not the general public, is also to be like, no, say like explicitly what you actually mean. Because not even just like, oh, there's one issue, which is like, oh yeah, you're separating scientists versus from a lesser general public, but it's also, you want for communication to be effective, you want it to be targeted. You want to get so much more specific.
Purpose, audience message.
Yes.
Yeah.
If there was a Bible of science communication, that would be on page 1. Communication journal. Yeah. Okay. So do you guys think we could summarize some of the problems with the knowledge deficit model that we mentioned?
I think one of the biggest problems is it assumes that people without scientific background like are lacking this knowledge, and that they are ignorant, and that they don't know anything.
Yeah, I get pretty pissed off. Someone thought I was dumb.
Yeah.
Thought they're not going to be receptive to education.
It's like, how dare you talk at me about this? I know what I'm talking about.
You can tell as well, can't you? Like,
when you have a conversation with someone and you're like, no, here are the facts, blah, blah, and they're like, how dare you assume that I don't know what I'm talking about? Like, I have my own experiences, blah, 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 you know?
And that's where we get into social constructivism, which is another term I've come across. But social constructivism is all about people have lived experience, essentially. They have their own values, beliefs. They've constructed a worldview through their lived experiences. What's wrong with the deficit model is that it assumes that people don't have that lens. That lens. And that they don't have their lived experience that they can apply to other situations and experiences.
And people are going to make meaning differently based off those experiences. And they're going to interpret things differently based off those experiences as well. And that includes science and how they interpret science.
Yeah. I mean, again, shout out Heather. Heather made us read this completely bizarre 1989 article about sheep farming in Canberra. It was close to my heart as a sheep farmer's daughter.
We can put that in the show notes.
I was going to say close to my heart as a sheep, and I was like,
no, I'm a sheep farmer's daughter, so it's like, this is really cool. But basically, it's about how there was nuclear fallout after the Chernobyl fallout in the late 80s, and in Canberra, which is part of the UK, again, I didn't know where Canberra was. And the sheep farmers in Canberra were saying, hey, we're picking up these really high levels of nuclear waste in our farms, and it's affecting our sheep. And the UK government of the time was going, no, it's fine. And then as time went on, it became really evident that there was indeed nuclear waste and fallout that was affecting their livestock. And the government eventually had to come to terms with the fact that the farmers were actually, they were on the right track and knew what they were talking about, and had to acknowledge that there was a problem. But basically the too long didn't read of that article that's done by Wynne is people know stuff.
Yeah.
And don't disrespect that.
Yeah, coming from an agricultural background as well myself, it's interesting talking to farmers and listening to them talk negatively about people that come in and tell them what to do and be like, there's this agronomist, or I don't know. And there's kind of this not very open dialogue of communication, and the farmers don't really want anyone to tell them what to do because they've been farming for years. They have all of this knowledge, and they don't really like people assuming that they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
That is also my experience, Kelly. So
yeah.
As a human being on this planet, I also don't like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really interesting. So
I just kind of wanted to say one thing is that, in my opinion, the deficit model is always going to have a place in society. I don't think it's ever going to leave. I think it's always going to be there. I think scientists and people in general are always going to want to share the things they're interested about. And there's always going to be some random niche podcast that someone's made on the internet about something. And there's always going to be someone that's going to want to absorb that knowledge.
Shout out to the SciComm Collective podcast.
Yes, that's us. And so I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's always going to be here. I think where it differs is like, I don't think the deficit model is ever going to create change or change people's behaviors. But that doesn't mean it's inherently has to be like abolished from society. I think it'll always have its place ingrained because there is always going to be people that want to share their knowledge in that way. And there's going to be people that are going to want to absorb that knowledge. What do you guys think?
I feel like I disagree with you, but it's on such a technicality.
Yeah.
So in this, one of the main things the main sort of logical fallacy, for want of a better word, or like not evidence-based thing about the deficit model that I think of is you're assuming that there's a knowledge deficit.
Yes.
And that you feel that something will change. So in my mind, it's like, yes, 100% there will be times that like primarily fact-based communication is what is needed.
I think there's scientists as well who don't realize they're communicating in the deficit
100%.
model, which is where like I don't see a problem with it because it's like scientists, they're just going to communicate. They want to put their stuff out there that they're passionate about. Where it is problematic is when it turns into that deficit model and where those scientists assume that people are ignorant and people are lacking this information. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we probably agree on that technically.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think it is about it's also even saying something like the deficit model. It's interesting you bring up Wynne because I think Wynne is attributed to like retroactively naming this phenomena. And it is that thing. No one went out and said like, no one planned to do this. It's just what people accidentally fell into. And then after the fact, and partly a lack of evaluation on communications methods, we're like, oh wait, is any of this evidence-based? Is this actually doing what we've assumed it's been doing? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree in the sense that it's all about knowing specifically what you're communicating and why.
Your intentions are.
Yeah, and if you know, obviously education, which and communication of facts is still extremely important. And if you've
and it's still going to have its place in society.
If you've identified that's what you want to do, then 100%. And I just wouldn't call that deficit model specifically. So that's where I'm like, technicality.
Yes, I agree with you. There's still going to be people in society who look up to scientists and want to absorb their knowledge and hold them on a pedestal, but don't see that as a problem. And they're just like, I look up to you, give me all of the knowledge, share your thoughts, and they just want to absorb it. And that's okay. You know, I think that's still going to have a place in society, whether we like it or not.
I think my key takeaway about learning about the deficit model is it's a privilege to have an audience that will want to listen to you.
Yeah.
It's a privilege to be a science communicator, and people will either learn from you or take some information away. And because of that, I've learned not to underestimate my audience and that it is a privilege to be a science communicator.
Yeah, and it's a privilege to have an audience. And then I guess the other way of looking at this is how do you communicate science in an effective way when you don't have an audience? And that probably leads into more of the dialogue form of communication and the participatory form of science communication. Is there any closing little snippets of information? Holly, you were saying something fun just before about editing the Wikipedia page on the deficit model because we were discussing the origins of the deficit model and who actually coined the term and where does it come from. And Holly has a nice little claim to fame there.
The first and only contribution I've made to the institution of Wikipedia is correcting the typo in the name of the person who is thought to have been involved in coining the term. Again, it's hard because it's kind of done retroactively, and I now have to look at my own Wikipedia article to remember who it was.
Can we put that in the show notes?
I absolutely will. It's also changed, but I don't know if there's any evidence any longer of me doing it, but hey, The H in the
Nice.
name John is still not there.
Claim it.
So I did my part.
You did your
Nice.
bit to contribute to the epistemologies, the knowledge making of the world. Well, I've been Kate,
I'm Kelly.
I'm Holly.
and thank you for listening to our episode all about the deficit model for the SciComm Collective.
Thanks for listening. Find us online at thepsychommcollective.com. That's com with 2 M's. Questions or comments about today's episode? Get in touch on Instagram at the SciComm Collective. The SciComm Collective is supported by UWA's Grand Challenges Impact Grant.